I was staring at my laptop screen in my Chicago penthouse when my mother's video call shattered everything I thought I knew about betrayal. Kevin's smug face filled half the screen, his arm draped possessively around my mother's trembling shoulders. She looked smaller than I remembered, her voice cracking as she rushed through the words like ripping off a bandage. They were selling the workshop. My father's workshop. The one he'd spent 40 years building into a cathedral of craftsmanship, where every tool had a story and every piece of wood held a memory. But it was Kevin who really made my blood run cold. He leaned into the camera, that snake oil smile spreading across his face, and offered me $10,000. $10,000. To keep my mouth shut about selling my father's legacy like it was a garage sale find. Then he said it, the words that would seal his fate. He called my father's work an outdated hobby, said the old man's precious lathe was rotting junk, laughed about how nobody cared about handmade boats anymore when you could buy fiberglass online. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just looked at him through that screen, my voice dropping to something I barely recognized as my own. This is war, Kevin. I hung up and immediately called Robert Chen, my father's estate attorney. The phone didn't even finish the first ring. Robert, activate the artisan clause. Freeze everything. I'm flying to Maine first thing tomorrow morning. If you're watching this and you've ever had someone try to destroy what your parents built, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want to see how this ends, because trust me, this story is just getting started. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done in my situation. Now let me take you back to where this all began. I need to start further back than 3 years ago. I need to start when I was 7 years old, standing in my father's workshop for the first time as something more than just a kid playing in the sawdust. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, the kind of Maine day where the light comes in golden and slanted through the workshop windows, making the dust motes look like they're dancing. My father, Michael Morgan, was working on a commission for a doctor from Boston who wanted a classic Rangeley lake boat, the kind with curved planking and brass fittings that looked like it belonged in a museum. I'd been watching him for an hour, completely silent, because even at 7 I understood that you didn't interrupt an artist at work. He was using a spoke shave to fair a plank, taking off translucent curls of cedar that fell around his boots like snow. The smell was intoxicating, sweet and sharp at the same time. When he finally looked up and saw me standing there, he didn't smile exactly. He just studied me with those serious gray eyes that never missed anything. "You've been watching me for 63 minutes, he said. "Why?" "I wanted to see how you knew where to cut." He set down the spoke shave and brushed the shavings off his workbench. "Come here." He lifted me up so I could see the plank properly. "This wood is western red cedar. It's been air drying in my shed for 7 years. See these lines here?" He traced his calloused finger along the grain. "That's the tree telling me where it wants to be shaped. If I try to force it against the grain, it'll split or tear or fight me every step of the way. But if I listen to what the wood is saying, if I work with it instead of against it, it'll reward me with strength and beauty. That's the secret, Venus. You don't force nature. You partner with it." That was the day I fell in love with woodworking. Not because it was easy or pretty or something girls were supposed to do, but because my father trusted me enough to share the secret language. He spoke with wood and tools and time. From that day forward, every day after school, I'd drop my backpack by the workshop door and become his shadow. I learned to sharpen chisels on whetstones, keeping the bevel angle precise. I learned the difference between rip saws and crosscut saws and why you'd use one over the other. I learned that white oak was better for ribs because it could be steam bent without breaking, while mahogany was better for trim because it held detail and resisted rot. By the time I was 12, I could operate most of the machines in the workshop under supervision. The table saw with its screaming blade that demanded absolute respect. The band saw that could cut curves if you fed the work slowly and steadily. The drill press that had to be set to the right speed for each type of wood and bit. And my favorite, the lathe, that magical machine that could turn a square block of wood into a perfectly round spindle or a graceful curved leg for a piece of furniture. My father had acquired that lathe from a shipyard closure in Portsmouth in 1978. It was a 1,940 seconds American pacemaker, cast iron and steel, weighing nearly 1,000 pounds. He'd spent 6 months restoring it, scraping off decades of neglect, replacing worn bearings, rebuilding the headstock hand, scraping the ways until they were perfectly flat. He used to say that lathe was the heart of the workshop. Everything important passed through it at some point. Every mast, every tiller, every decorative element that made a Morgan boat recognizable. But it wasn't just about the boats. My father was teaching me something deeper, something about patience and attention and the relationship between maker and material. We'd be working on a project and he'd stop mid-stroke with a hand plane and point out how the shavings were coming off. See that? They're curling smooth and continuous. That means the blade is sharp and properly set and I'm working with the grain. But look at this. He'd adjust something almost imperceptibly and take another stroke. Now they're tearing. That means something is wrong and I need to stop and figure out what before I ruin the work. He was teaching me to listen, to pay attention, to care about the difference between good enough and right. And he was teaching me something else, though. I didn't understand it until much later. He was teaching me to be patient and strategic, to see 3 moves ahead like a chess player. Because in woodworking, you can't take back a cut. You can't unsaw a board or unhammer a nail without leaving a mark. You have to plan your moves carefully, thinking through the entire sequence before you make the first cut. My mother, Jennifer, never understood any of this. She came from a banking family in Massachusetts, people who measured success in quarterly earnings and portfolio growth. She'd met my father at a boat show in Boston when she was 24 and he was 30, this rough-handed Maine craftsman who was nothing like the business school graduates and young lawyers her parents kept trying to set her up with. I think she fell in love with the romance of it, the idea of being married to an artist, of having this connection to something authentic and real. But the reality of being married to a master craftsman was different than the romance. My father worked long hours for what seemed like very little money, at least compared to what her college friends' husbands were making. A custom boat might take 3 to 6 months to build and sell for $40,000 back in the 90s, which sounds like good money until you subtract materials overhead and divide what's left by the hours invested. My father was never going to make us rich. We lived comfortably in a modest house on 3 acres of rocky Maine coastline, but there were no country club memberships or luxury vacations. My mother threw herself into being a supportive wife and running the business side of things, handling bookings and deposits and client communications. But I could see, even as a kid, that part of her was disappointed. She'd thought she was marrying an artist who'd get discovered and become famous, whose boats would be in magazines and museums, who'd eventually parlay his talent into something bigger. What she got was a stubborn traditionalist who turned down mass production opportunities and licensing deals because he refused to put his name on anything he hadn't personally built or supervised. The tension was always there, humming like a power tool left running in the background. Little arguments about money, about my father's refusal to advertise or court wealthy clients, about his insistence on using expensive traditional materials when cheaper alternatives existed. They never fought in front of me, but I'd hear their voices through walls late at night, my mother's frustration and my father's quiet, immovable responses. Then there was the question of my future. My mother wanted me to go to an elite boarding school, then an Ivy League college to become something important in her world. A doctor, a lawyer, an investment banker, anything that came with prestige and money and the ability to live somewhere other than coastal Maine. My father never said much during these conversations, but I could see his jaw tighten when my mother would talk about me having bigger opportunities than wasting my life in a workshop. When I was 15, I told them both that I wanted to study architecture with a focus on historic preservation. It was my compromise, my way of honoring what my father had taught me while pursuing something my mother could brag about to her friends. I could work with my hands and my mind. I could design and build. I could be part of preserving traditional skills while having a career that existed beyond one workshop in Maine. My father nodded slowly when I explained this. That's good, Venus. You'll learn things I never could teach you. Structural engineering materials, science, the theory behind what we do. But don't forget the hand skills. Don't forget how to listen to wood. Because once you lose that connection, once everything becomes just theory and computer models, you lose the soul of it. My mother was thrilled. Architecture was respectable, prestigious even. She started talking about me going to MIT or Cornell, becoming the next great architect designing museums and concert halls. I just smiled and let her plan my future while my father and I continued building boats in comfortable silence. The summer I turned 17, something shifted. My father started acting strange, secretive in a way he'd never been before. He'd always been an open book in the workshop, explaining every decision, every technique, but suddenly he was working on projects late at night after sending me home. I'd come in the morning and find sawdust swept up, tools cleaned and put away, but no sign of what he'd been working on. One night in July, I snuck back to the workshop after my parents thought I was asleep. The lights were on and I could hear the lathe running. I crept up to the window and looked in. My father was at his desk, not working on a boat at all, but hunched over papers. Legal documents. He had Robert Chen there, his attorney, and they were going through page after page of something, my father pointing at clauses and asking questions, Robert explaining things and taking notes. I couldn't hear what they were saying over the sound of the lathe, which I realized was running as a sort of cover noise. But I could see my father's face, and he looked worried in a way I'd never seen before. Not scared exactly, but grimly determined, like a man preparing for a siege he knew was coming. The next day I asked him directly, "Dad, what were you and Mr. Chen working on last night?" He looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. "How long were you watching?" "Long enough to know it wasn't about a boat." He wiped his hands on his shop apron and gestured for me to sit on the stool by his workbench. "Venus, I need to tell you some things about business and family and the future. Your mother and I, we love each other, but we've been growing apart for a long time. You've noticed. I can see it in your eyes when you watch us pretend everything is fine." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "When I die, and that's not an if, that's a when, your mother is going to be vulnerable. She's going to be sad and lonely and scared about money, even though there will be plenty. And there are men in this world who can smell that vulnerability, like blood in the water. They'll come around offering to help, to take care of things, to handle the business. And they'll rob her blind while making her think they're doing her a favor. Dad, you're not dying anytime soon." He smiled sadly. "My father died of a heart attack at 57. His father died of a stroke at 54. My grandfather died at 52, also a heart attack. The Morgan men don't make old bones, Venus. We burn bright and we burn out. I'm 53 years old and I can feel my heart struggling some mornings. I've been to the doctor. I've had tests. Everything says I'm fine, but I know my body and I know my family history. I don't think I have a lot of time left." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. "You can't know that." "Maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong and I'll live to be 90. But I'd be a fool not to prepare for the alternative. So I'm setting things up to protect your mother and protect this business. I'm creating legal structures that will make it very hard for someone to come in and destroy what I've built. And I'm putting you at the center of those protections because you're the only person I trust to understand what this place really means." That's when he explained the artisan clause to me for the first time. He'd been working with Robert Chen to create a business structure where the workshop couldn't be sold or significantly altered without the consent of a family member who could demonstrate actual expertise in traditional boat building. Not just someone who'd hung around the workshop, but someone with documented skills, education, and experience. Someone who'd earned the right to have a say. "But Dad, Mom owns the business with you. After you're gone, it'll be hers." "On paper, yes. But the artisan clause is written into the founding documents of the business entity itself. It's not about ownership, it's about preservation. Think of it like a historic building that's been landmarked. The owner can live in it, can maintain it, can even make certain changes. But they can't tear it down or fundamentally alter it without approval from the preservation board. In this case, you're the preservation board." He pulled out a folder and showed me the documents. They were dense with legal language, but the core was clear. Any direct descendant of Michael Morgan who held professional credentials in traditional craftsmanship had veto power over major business decisions. Sales, liquidations, equipment disposals beyond normal wear and tear, changes to the fundamental business model, all of it required sign-off from the qualifying descendant. But there was a catch. The descendant had to maintain active involvement in the business or the field. They couldn't just be someone who'd learned some skills as a kid and then walked away. They had to be able to demonstrate continuing expertise, ongoing education, professional recognition. Otherwise, a court could rule the clause invalid. "This is your inheritance, Venus. Not money, though, there will be some of that. Not property, though, you'll have claim to this land. This is your inheritance. The responsibility to protect what we've built here. But I can't make you take it. If you go off to college and become an architect and never look back, never maintain your woodworking skills, never stay connected to this world, then the clause won't protect anything. It only works if you're willing to be the guardian." "I promise," I said immediately. "Whatever it takes." He pulled me into a hug and I felt him trembling slightly. "I know you mean that now. But you're 17 years old. You have no idea what I'm asking of you. What I'm asking is that you might have to give up your own life for a while to come back and fight for this place. What I'm asking is that you might have to watch your mother make terrible decisions and not be able to stop her until the moment is right. What I'm asking is patience and strategy and sacrifice. So I want you to think about it. Really think about it. Don't answer now." But I already knew my answer. This workshop was more than just a business. It was my father's soul made visible. It was the place where I'd learned to think and work and see beauty in raw materials. It was the foundation of everything I understood about quality and integrity, and the difference between making things and making things that mattered. Of course, I would protect it. On my 18th birthday, 6 months before I left for college, my father gave me a letter in a sealed envelope. "Don't open this unless the workshop is in danger," he said. "Everything you need to know is in there. All my reasoning, all my plans, all the things I couldn't say out loud. Robert has a copy too. But this one is yours." I put it in my desk drawer and tried not to think about why he was giving it to me. 3 months later, on a cold February morning, my father had a massive heart attack while fitting the transom on a Cape Cod catboat commission. One of his apprentices found him collapsed by the workbench tools still in his hands. The paramedics said he was probably dead before he hit the floor. The doctor said his heart had just given out a widowmaker, they called it, the kind of blockage that kills you so fast you don't even have time to be afraid. The funeral was a blur. People came from all over New England, clients whose boats my father had built, craftsmen who'd learned from him, suppliers who'd worked with him for decades. They all told stories about his generosity, his perfectionism, his quiet intensity. My mother stood through it all like a ghost, accepting condolences with a frozen smile, barely holding herself together. I was numb. I'd known it was coming, had been told explicitly to prepare for it, and I still wasn't ready. Nothing prepares you for the moment when your father stops being a person and becomes a memory. I kept expecting him to walk through the door with sawdust in his hair to explain that this was all a mistake to go back to the workshop and finish that catboat commission. The day after the funeral, I opened the letter. My father's handwriting filled 3 pages, and reading it was like hearing his voice from beyond the grave. "Venus, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're facing a decision. Right now, you're probably being pressured from multiple directions. Your mother is overwhelmed, and people are offering to help in ways that sound generous but aren't. Someone has probably already suggested selling the workshop or modernizing it or doing something that would fundamentally change what it is. And you're 18 years old, legally an adult but practically still a kid, and everyone is telling you to focus on school and let the adults handle things. Here's what I need you to understand. The workshop is going to be attacked. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in an obvious way, but it will happen. Someone will see an opportunity to profit from your mother's grief and my absence. They'll position themselves as a savior, a partner, someone who can take the burden off her shoulders. And they'll systematically loot everything I built while convincing her it's for the best. You cannot stop this by fighting directly. You're too young, too inexperienced, too easy to dismiss. If you try to intervene now, you'll lose. Your mother won't listen to you. The courts won't take you seriously. You'll spend your college fund on lawyers and accomplish nothing except alienating your family. What you need to do is step back. Go to school. Get educated. Become someone they cannot dismiss. Build your credentials in traditional craftsmanship while you're building your architecture career. Document everything. Stay in touch with Robert Chen and let him monitor the situation. And when the time is right, when whoever is attacking the workshop has dug themselves deep enough that you can bury them, then you come back and you use the artisan claws like a weapon. This is going to be hard. You're going to have to watch things get worse while you prepare. You're going to second-guess yourself 1,000 times. You're going to wonder if you're doing the right thing. But trust me, trust the plan. Because I built this protection specifically for this scenario, and it only works if you're patient enough to let it develop. I love you. I'm proud of you. And I know you're strong enough to do this because you're my daughter, and the Morgan family has never backed down from a fight we knew we could win. The letter was signed with his name and dated 3 months before he died. He'd known. He'd actually known his time was running out, and he'd spent his last months preparing me to fight a war that hadn't started yet. I sat in my childhood bedroom holding that letter, and I made a choice. I would do exactly what he said. I would be patient. I would prepare. And when the time came, I would destroy anyone who tried to take his legacy. 3 days after the funeral, Kevin showed up. I'd seen him around town before, one of those guys who's always got a scheme going, always talking about opportunities and investments and the next big thing. He'd been dating my mother casually for a few months, though my father had never mentioned him and I'd never seen them together. He showed up at our house with flowers and sympathy and an eagerness to help that made my skin crawl. My mother, drowning in grief and paperwork and decisions she didn't know how to make, welcomed him like a life raft. Within a week, he'd moved himself into our house. Within 2 weeks, he was going through my father's business files and offering suggestions. Within a month, he was telling my mother that the workshop needed to be modernized or sold because traditional boat building was a dying art and she couldn't afford to keep running it as a memorial. I watched all of this from the sidelines, biting my tongue until I tasted blood. I called Robert Chen, and he confirmed what my father had predicted. Kevin was exactly the type of predator the artisan clause was designed to stop. But if we activated it now, Kevin would just position it as a bratty daughter trying to override her grieving mother's decisions. We needed to let Kevin make his moves, document everything, and wait until he'd committed enough provable harm that a court couldn't ignore it. So I left. I went to the University of Illinois to study architecture, and it felt like abandoning my mother to a wolf. But I remembered my father's letter. Trust the plan. Be patient. Get strong enough to win. College became my training ground. I took every class I could find on historic preservation, traditional construction techniques, architectural history. I joined the woodworking club and became its president. I spent my summers not partying or interning at big firms but apprenticing with master craftsmen. I worked for 3 months in Massachusetts with a boat builder who specialized in restoration work on historic vessels. I spent a summer in Minnesota learning timber frame construction from an old Norwegian carpenter. I even spent 6 weeks in England learning traditional furniture making techniques at a workshop that had been operating since the 1700s. And every month, Robert Chen sent me a detailed report about what Kevin was doing to my father's business. The reports read like a slow-motion catastrophe. Kevin fired the 3 master craftsmen my father had trained men who'd worked in that workshop for decades. He replaced them with cheap labor hired off Craigslist people who didn't know the difference between a dovetail and a butt joint. He started taking shortcuts on the commissions that were still in the pipeline, using screws instead of proper joinery, using plywood instead of selected planks, using marine adhesive instead of proper fitting and fastening. The quality collapsed. Boats that should have been heirlooms became garage project quality. Clients started complaining. Some demanded refunds. Others accepted their substandard boats with resignation, sad that the Morgan name didn't mean what it used to. Kevin responded by lowering prices and marketing to a different clientele, people who wanted something that looked like a wooden boat but didn't care about actual craftsmanship. He also started liquidating assets. The reports would list items sold each month. A collection of antique hand planes that my father had assembled over decades, sold to a tool dealer for a fraction of their value. A supply of aged lumber that my father had been curing for years, sold by the board foot to a local contractor. Brass fittings and bronze fasteners and marine hardware all sold off to marine supply shops for cash. But Kevin was clever about it. He kept the business technically solvent. He paid enough bills to avoid bankruptcy. He filed the paperwork to keep the business license active. He even brought in enough revenue with his cheap boats that on paper the business looked functional. It was dying, its reputation destroyed, and its assets stripped, but it was dying slowly enough that no one could point to a specific criminal act. And my mother went along with all of it. Robert's reports included summaries of conversations he'd had with her, attempts to warn her that Kevin was destroying my father's legacy. She defended Kevin every time. He's trying his best. This business was dying anyway. Michael was too stubborn to modernize, and it cost us. Kevin is doing what needs to be done to keep us afloat. Robert thinks, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm the owner and I'm making these decisions. Every month brought agony. Robert's reports. Kevin's destruction. My desperate calls begging to intervene. And Robert's calm reply, not yet. You're not ready. Wait. So I built my armor. Bachelor's degree with highest honors. Thesis on historic preservation published in academic journals. Master's program at Cornell. 2 years at a Chicago restoration firm working on timber frame barns, Victorian houses, historic boats. Every project documented. Every expert consultation recorded. Articles in Wooden Boat magazine establishing Venus Morgan as a voice in traditional craftsmanship. While I built credentials, Kevin built his empire of theft. He mortgaged the property. Made himself co-owner. Slapped the Morgan name on cheap fiberglass kayaks. Turned my father's organized workshop into chaos, lumber storage into kayak warehouses, craftsmanship into carnival. Then came the call that broke me. 3rd year away. Venus Kevin sold your father's lathe. The 1,940 seconds pacemaker. $200 to a scrapyard. The heart of the workshop. Gone. I couldn't breathe. Buy it back. I don't care what it costs. I'm coming home soon. That night in my Chicago apartment, I finally let myself feel it. 3 years watching destruction. 3 years of patience. 3 years of my father's voice, wait. Get strong. Then strike. I was done waiting. I called Robert. It's time. Activate the artisan clause. I want everything. Every asset sold, every dollar stolen, every criminal charge possible. I'm not just taking back the workshop. I'm destroying Kevin. Robert hesitated. Your mother will choose him. You'll fight your own family. Dad knew. That's why he prepared me. Kevin thinks I ran away from grief. He's about to learn I prepared for war. 6 months of building the case. Evidence. Depositions. Documentation. Then Kevin made his fatal mistake. Found a buyer for the property. Development company offering pennies to tear down the workshop and build condos. Days from closing, and in his arrogance, he decided to bring me in. Offer me $10,000 to keep quiet. He handed me everything. The video call recorded. The bribe documented. His contempt for my father on record. Game over. When I booked that flight, I wasn't going home to save anything. I was going home to reclaim what was mine and bury the man who tried to take it. Maine air hit me like salt and memories. I'd rented a black Land Rover, something that said I wasn't asking permission. Robert's office first. Strategy before confrontation. His conference room looked like a war room. 3 years of documentation spread across the table. Financial records. Asset inventories. Client complaints. Witness statements. Robert handed me the summary. $85,000 embezzled. $200,000 in equipment sold for pennies. Client list destroyed. My mother's signatures forged on documents giving Kevin control. Then the bombshell. Robert pulled out another folder. That development company, Shell Corporation, 3 layers deep. Silent partner, Kevin's brother-in-law. He's buying the property from himself through a fake company, paying your mother nothing, planning to flip it for millions. That's fraud. Several kinds. Real estate fraud. Wire fraud. Possibly racketeering. Kevin's not just a con man. He's running a criminal operation. Can we prove it? Bank records. Forged signatures. Your mother's recorded admissions. And the artisan clause making every asset sale illegal without your consent. We've got him. What happens to my mother? If she cooperates, nothing. She's a victim. If she stands by Kevin, she's an accomplice. I looked at all the evidence spread across that table and felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. When do we confront them? They're waiting at your mother's house. Kevin doesn't know what this meeting is about. He thinks I called you home to sign off on the sale, that I'm going to facilitate the deal. Your mother thinks the same thing. They think this is a formality. Then let's not keep them waiting. We drove in separate cars, Robert in his practical Subaru, me in the imposing Land Rover. The house I'd grown up in looked shabby in a way it never had when my father was alive. The paint was peeling. The shutters hung crooked. The garden my mother had once maintained was overgrown with weeds. It looked like a place where people had given up. Kevin's truck was parked in the driveway, a lifted pickup with oversized tires and custom rims, the kind of vehicle that cost $50,000 and said I have more money than sense. My mother's sedan was in the garage, visible through the open door, and it looked like it hadn't been washed in months. I sat in my car for a minute, gathering myself. This was it. The moment 3 years of preparation had been building toward. My father had known this day would come. He'd prepared me for it. He'd given me the weapons I'd need. Now I just had to be strong enough to use them. Robert knocked on the door and my mother answered. She looked even smaller in person than she had on the video call. She'd aged a decade in 3 years. Her hair was completely gray, now pulled back in a careless ponytail. She wore jeans and a sweatshirt that had paint stains, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Fear. Hope. Guilt. Venus. You came. You asked me to. We went inside, and Kevin was sprawled on my father's favorite chair, a leather recliner that had molded itself to my father's shape over 20 years. Seeing Kevin in that chair made my hands curl into fists. He had a beer even though it wasn't even 10 in the morning, and he smiled at me like we were old friends. Well, well. The prodigal daughter returns. Ready to talk business. I set my briefcase on the coffee table and sat down across from him very deliberately, very calmly. Actually, Kevin, I'm here to inform you that you're finished. His smile faltered. Excuse me. Robert, if you would. Robert pulled out his laptop and connected it to the TV, the same TV my family had watched movies on when I was a kid. He pulled up the first document, the Artisan Clause, in 30-point font, so there was no way to miss it. This is the founding document of Morgan Boats. Filed with the state of Maine in 1985, updated in 2018, just months before Michael Morgan died. It contains what's known as an Artisan Clause, a preservation protection that requires the consent of any direct descendant who holds professional credentials in traditional craftsmanship before the business can be sold significantly, altered, or have its assets liquidated. Kevin snorted. That's ancient history. Doesn't mean anything now. Actually, it means everything now. Robert pulled up the next document, my credentials. Venus Morgan completed her bachelor's degree in architecture with a specialization in historic preservation. She then completed a master's degree in the same field. She's worked for 3 years with a prestigious restoration firm specializing in traditional wooden structure preservation. She's published extensively in trade journals and academic publications about traditional boat building and woodworking techniques. She's been recognized as an expert in the field by the Wooden Boat Foundation, the International Preservation Society, and the Traditional Maritime Skills Alliance. She is by any legal definition exactly the kind of expert the Artisan Clause requires. My mother had gone pale. Venus, what is this? This is me doing what Dad asked me to do. This is me protecting his legacy from someone who's been systematically destroying it. Kevin stood up fast enough to knock over his beer. Bullshit. Your mother owns this business. She can sell it to whoever she wants. Actually, she can't. Robert clicked to the next document. Because every major decision Kevin has made over the past 3 years required Venus's consent under the Artisan Clause. Every equipment sale, every asset liquidation, every change to the business model. None of it was legally valid. Which means Kevin has been selling property he had no authority to sell, which in legal terms is called theft. The next slides came fast, each one more damning than the last. Bank records showing money being moved from business accounts to Kevin's personal accounts. A forensic accounting analysis showing $85,000 unaccounted for. Client complaints documenting the decline in quality. Expert assessments showing equipment had been sold for a fraction of its value. And the big finale, the trail connecting the development company to Kevin's brother-in-law, showing the whole thing was a fraud to steal the property. My mother stared at the screen, tears streaming. Kevin, you said we were partners. Kevin's face went purple. This business was failing. She abandoned you. Those credentials mean nothing. I stood. I didn't abandon anyone, Kevin. I went away to become strong enough to stop you. My father knew predators like you would come. I spent 3 years documenting your crimes, waiting for you to dig deep enough to bury yourself. And now you have. Kevin lunged. You little bitch. 3 years of Krav Maga paid off in one move. I grabbed his wrist and put him face first into the wall, hard enough to rattle every family photo. Robert had his phone out. Police are coming. That's assault. Kevin screamed threats. My mother sobbed. I held him against that wall waiting. 2 officers arrived. Both former Morgan Boats customers. They understood immediately. Kevin was cuffed in seconds, lunging at me even as they led him away. Robert mentioned the embezzlement to the DA. Kevin kept screaming threats until the patrol car door shut him off. I sat next to my mother. Mom, why? Her eyes were hollow. I was so lonely. Kevin was there. He said he'd take care of everything. I was drowning and he threw me a rope. How was I supposed to know it was tied to an anchor? Dad knew. That's why he built the protections. She flinched. Are you going to forgive me? I don't know. But I'll help you. Robert will get you an attorney. You'll cooperate with the investigation. And you'll let me run the business the way Dad wanted. What about us? I don't know that either. Let's start with keeping you out of jail. I left her there with Robert going over what she needed to do, what she needed to say to the investigators. I got in my Land Rover and drove to the workshop, not ready to see it but needing to face it. The sign was wrong. Morgan Marine Manufacturing instead of Morgan Boats Traditional Craftsmanship. Since 1953, the vinyl banner was sun-faded and cheap-looking, mounted on posts where the carved wooden sign had hung. I made a mental note to have the original sign remade. First of many corrections. The workshop door was unlocked. Inside it was worse than I'd feared. The smell hit me first plastic and chemicals and industrial adhesives instead of wood and varnish and linseed oil. The space my father had organized so carefully was chaos. Cheap aluminum workbenches covered in junk. Fiberglass molds leaning against walls. Stacks of factory-cut plywood. kayaks and camping equipment piled randomly. And there, in the corner where my father's lathe had stood, was just empty space. An oil stain on the concrete marking where the heart of the workshop had been. I stood there staring at that empty space, and I felt something break inside me. 3 years of holding it together, of being strong, of being patient. All of it shattered in that moment. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor and finally let myself cry. Not quiet tears, but these ugly, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep. I cried for my father and the business he'd built and the standards he'd maintained. I cried for my mother, who'd been so lost in grief that she'd let a predator in. I cried for the 3 years I'd spent watching and waiting while everything was destroyed. And I cried for the girl I'd been, the one who'd learned craftsmanship in this space, who'd been so sure that quality and integrity mattered. Robert found me there an hour later. He didn't say anything, just sat down next to me on the floor. We sat there in silence in the middle of the ruined workshop, two people who'd loved the same man and tried to protect what he'd built. "Can we fix it?" I finally asked. "Legally, yes. Physically, it's going to take time and money. But we can get it back. A lot of your father's tools ended up in collections bought by people who recognize their quality. Some of them are willing to sell back now that they understand the situation. The lathe is in storage. The lumber Kevin sold went to reputable dealers who kept good records. We can recover or replace most of what was lost. And Kevin, he's going to prison. The DA's office is already talking about a plea deal, 5 to 7 years minimum. The evidence is overwhelming. He'll be 60 years old by the time he gets out, and he'll spend the rest of his life paying restitution he'll never be able to afford. That doesn't feel like enough. It never does. But it's what we've got." Robert stood up and offered me his hand. "Come on, let's document everything. We need photographs for the insurance claim and the legal case. And you need to see all of it, the good and the bad, before you decide what comes next." We spent the next 4 hours going through the workshop systematically. I photographed every corner, every piece of cheap equipment Kevin had brought in, every sign of neglect. Robert took notes documenting everything for the legal case. And slowly, as we worked, I started to see past the destruction. The bones of the building were still good. The post and beam structure my great-grandfather had built in 1953 was solid. The electrical service my father had upgraded to handle modern tools was intact. The heating system was functioning. The windows that let in that perfect north light hadn't been changed. The loading dock where finished boats were rolled out to waiting trailers was still there. The foundation, both literal and metaphorical, hadn't been destroyed. It had just been buried under garbage. We were about to leave when I noticed something in the corner. The cheap metal shelving Kevin had installed wasn't sitting flat on the floor. I walked over and knelt down, running my fingers along the old wooden floorboards. One section looked wrong, like the boards had been pried up and replaced badly. "Robert, help me move this shelving." We shifted it out of the way, and I examined the floor more carefully. There. One board was shorter than the others, easy to lift if you knew it was there. I pried it up and my heart stopped. Underneath, wrapped in oiled canvas that smelled like my childhood, was a wooden case I recognized immediately. My father's personal tool set, the ones that had belonged to his father and grandfather. The chisels with horn handles worn smooth by 3 generations of hands. The hand planes older than anyone living. The marking gauges and spoke shaves and draw knives that weren't just tools but family heirlooms. He hid them. My voice came out as a whisper. Dad knew someone might come after the workshop. He hid the most important pieces where they'd never be found, unless someone who loved this place went looking. I lifted each tool carefully, reverently. They were exactly as I remembered. The 1/2-inch chisel my great-grandfather had used to carve decorative elements on his first commissioned yacht. The smoothing plane my grandfather had used to fair planking on fishing boats. The marking gauge my father had used to lay out joinery for 40 years. Each one a piece of family history, each one a connection to men I'd never met but whose work I'd studied and admired. Robert took photographs while I cleaned each tool with an old rag I found nearby. The dust came off easily, and underneath the steel still gleamed, the wood still glowed with the patina of use. My father had maintained them before hiding them, made sure they'd be ready whenever I found them. At the very bottom of the case was another envelope, sealed like the first letter with my name written in my father's distinctive handwriting. I looked at Robert. He nodded. "Open it." Inside was a single page. "Venus, if you found this, then everything I feared came to pass. The workshop was attacked, someone tried to destroy it, and you came home to fight. I'm proud of you. I'm proud that you were strong enough to leave and patient enough to wait and brave enough to come back. These tools are yours now. Use them to rebuild what was lost. Use them to teach a new generation. Use them to keep the craft alive. And know that I'm with you every step of the way. Love, Dad. I held that letter and I let myself cry one more time. But these weren't tears of grief or anger. These were tears of relief and gratitude and something like grace. My father had known. He'd prepared. And he'd trusted me to finish what he'd started. That night I stayed at the same motel I'd checked into earlier, the one where families came to pick up their boats. Mrs. Patterson, the owner, brought me dinner without asking homemade chicken pot pie and fresh rolls. She didn't ask questions about why I was back or what had happened. She just patted my hand and said your father was a good man and left me alone with my thoughts. I spent the evening cleaning each of my father's tools, really cleaning them, removing every speck of dust and grime. I sharpened the chisels on my father's whetstones, checking the bevel angles by feel. I waxed the wooden handles until they glowed. I oiled the metal parts with camellia oil to prevent rust. And while I worked, I planned. The next 2 weeks were a blur of meetings and lawyers and investigators. Kevin was formally charged with embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and theft. The list of charges kept growing as Robert's investigation uncovered more crimes. The development company deal was exposed as fraud, with Kevin's brother-in-law turning state's witness to save himself. My mother filed for divorce and agreed to cooperate fully with the prosecution in exchange for immunity. The court hearing for permanent control of the workshop was almost anticlimactic. I presented my credentials. Robert presented the evidence of Kevin's crimes, and the judge, a woman in her 60s who introduced herself as a former Morgan Boats customer, didn't even need to deliberate. The artisan clause was valid. My credentials were impeccable. Kevin's fraud was undeniable. Full control of Morgan Boats transferred to me effective immediately, with my mother retaining a minority, non-controlling share that gave her financial security but no decision-making power. Kevin tried to disrupt the hearing, shouting from the defendant's table about ungrateful children and biased judges and corrupt lawyers. His own attorney looked mortified and tried to quiet him. The judge threatened him with contempt, which just made him angrier. As I walked out of that courtroom, Kevin's screaming threats behind me, I felt like I could finally breathe. The restoration took months. I hired back the 2 craftsmen Kevin had fired who still lived in the area. Marcus Okonkwo, who'd apprenticed with my father for 7 years and had gone to work at a boatyard in Portland, and Sarah Chen, Robert's niece, who'd spent summers learning from my father and had opened her own furniture shop in Portland. They both dropped everything to help rebuild. The 3rd craftsman, Jim Peterson, had retired to Florida, but he sent me detailed notes about every unfinished project from my father's last year, every client commitment Kevin had abandoned. He also sent me something precious, a full set of my father's project notebooks going back 20 years, detailing every boat built, every technique used, every problem solved. Jim had taken them for safekeeping the day Kevin fired him. I spent $50,000 of my own savings money I'd been saving to buy my first house in Chicago on the restoration. We rented a dumpster and filled it with everything Kevin had brought in. The cheap aluminum benches, the fiberglass molds, the kayaks and camping gear. All of it gone. We pulled up the sections of floor that had been damaged and replaced them with matching wood I sourced from a demolition company specializing in old buildings. We cleaned every surface, scrubbed away years of chemical residue, got the space back to bare wood and clean concrete. The lathe was the biggest project. When Tom Peterson's scrapyard delivered it, my heart sank. Kevin had tried to remove it himself and had damaged the tailstock. The motor mounts were bent. Someone had pried off the bronze nameplate, probably planning to sell it separately. But the bones were still good, the ways were still true, the massive cast iron bed was still straight. Marcus and I spent a week on the restoration. We disassembled everything down to individual components. We found cracks in the tailstock casting and sent it to a foundry for welding. We fabricated new motor mounts, copying the originals but making them stronger. We hand-scraped the ways, taking off microscopic amounts of metal to get them perfectly flat. We rebuilt the headstock bearings, cleaning out old grease and replacing it with proper oil bath lubrication. And we found a bronze fabricator who could make a new nameplate matching the original American pacemaker serial, number 1947 to 2891, restored by Michael Morgan 1978, restored by Venus Morgan 2024. When we finally had it reassembled and back in its place of honor, when we turned it on and heard that distinctive hum of a perfectly balanced machine, I cried again. This was the heart of the workshop. This was the machine my father had loved, and now it was home. We also tracked down my father's tools, the ones Kevin had sold. The antique handplane collection had gone to a dealer in Massachusetts who specialized in vintage tools. When I called him and explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. "Your father's planes are legendary in the collecting community. I'll sell them back to you at cost. Same as I paid Kevin. Consider the rest a donation to preserving his legacy." I drove to Massachusetts and brought them home in person, 3 milk crates full of tools that represented a century of collected craftsmanship. Other tools came back through similar channels. Craftspeople who'd bought equipment at Kevin's fire sales returned it when they learned the truth, many refusing payment. A timber framer in New Hampshire drove 4 hours to return a mortise chisel set. A furniture maker in Vermont shipped back a collection of molding planes. A boat builder in Massachusetts brought back specialized boat building tools, including the steam bending jigs my father had custom made. The community of craftspeople, people who understood what tools meant beyond just their monetary value, rallied around the restoration. The lumber was harder to recover, but we found enough. The contractor Kevin had sold my father's aged stock to had recognized its quality and had kept most of it separate, planning to use it for special projects. He sold it back to me at cost, 3,000 board feet of cedar and mahogany and white oak that had been curing for years. It wasn't everything my father had accumulated, but it was enough to start. 6 months after I came home, the workshop looked like itself again. The careful organization was restored. Each station had the right tools for its purpose. The lumber was properly stored and labeled. The space smelled like wood and varnish instead of chemicals. And hanging over the main entrance where Kevin's cheap vinyl banner had been was a new carved wooden sign. "Morgan Boat's Traditional Craftsmanship, since 1953. I'd carved it myself, using the skills my father had taught me, letting my hands remember lessons from 20 years ago. But I'd also made some changes. My father's workshop had been focused on one thing, building boats. I wanted it to be bigger than that. I wanted it to preserve the knowledge and pass it on. So I'd started drawing up plans for something new. The Michael Morgan Institute for Traditional Craftsmanship. The concept was simple. The workshop would continue taking boat commissions, but it would also become a teaching space. Apprentices could come learn traditional skills in exchange for their labor on projects. We'd offer intensive workshops on specific techniques. We'd host visiting master craftspeople for demonstrations and classes. And we'd document everything, creating a library of traditional techniques that would outlive all of us. I hired Eric Johansson to be the master builder and director of training. He was a 62-year-old Norwegian who trained in traditional wooden boat building in Bergen before immigrating to the US 30 years ago. He'd known my father had bought tools from him, had collaborated on a few projects, and he understood exactly what I was trying to build. Not just a workshop, but a living tradition. My mother and I were slowly rebuilding our relationship, but it was hard. We met every Tuesday morning at the coffee shop downtown Neutral Territory, where neither of us had too many memories. The conversations were awkward at first, both of us avoiding the big topics. But gradually, carefully, we started being honest with each other. She told me about the loneliness after my father died, how the house felt like a tomb, how his absence was so overwhelming that she couldn't breathe some days, how Kevin had seemed like a lifeline, someone who would fill the silence. She cried when she described how he'd gradually taken over, how each small concession led to a bigger one, how by the time she realized what was happening, it felt too late to stop. I told her about the anger I'd carried watching from a distance while Kevin destroyed everything, about the nights I'd wanted to call her and beg her to wake up, about how hard it had been to trust my father's plan when every instinct said to fight immediately, about how scared I'd been that I'd waited too long. We were both victims of the same predator, just in different ways. She'd been manipulated through grief and loneliness. I'd been forced to watch helplessly while maintaining a long game that required inhuman patience. Kevin had hurt both of us, and we were both trying to heal. Robert helped set up a trust for my mother's financial security. My father's life insurance and savings, the accounts Kevin had never known about, ensured she'd be comfortable for the rest of her life. She wouldn't live in luxury, but she'd never worry about bills. And that financial security, ironically, was giving her space to finally grieve properly, to mourn my father, without the panic of thinking she couldn't survive without him. She asked one Tuesday if she could visit the workshop. I'd been dreading this, but I said yes. When she walked in and saw what we'd accomplished, saw the space restored to something close to how my father had kept it, she broke down completely. She stood there in the middle of the workshop, surrounded by the smell of wood and the gleam of tools, and she cried like her heart was breaking. "I'm so sorry. She kept saying it over and over. I'm so sorry I let him destroy this. I'm so sorry I didn't listen to you. I'm so sorry I chose Kevin over your father's memory. I hugged her finally for the first time since I'd come home. You didn't know. He was good at what he did. And I'm sorry too. Sorry I had to leave you alone when you needed someone. Your father knew, didn't he? He knew this would happen. He didn't know specifics, but he knew someone would try. That's why he built the protections. He trusted me to be strong enough to use them. She pulled back and looked at me. You're so much like him. That same stubborn integrity. That same refusal to compromise on what matters. I used to resent it in him. All those opportunities he turned down because they meant sacrificing quality. All those lucrative contracts he walked away from because the clients wanted fast and cheap instead of beautiful and lasting. I thought he was foolish, but he was right. And you're right. This matters more than money. After that visit, things started improving between us. Not back to normal because normal was gone forever, but forward to something new. She started helping with the administrative side of the business, handling client communications and scheduling the things she'd done when my father was alive. And she started seeing a therapist working through the grief and guilt and shame of the Kevin years. Kevin's criminal case moved forward. His lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence was too overwhelming and the charges too serious. The case went to trial and I had to testify. Had to sit in a witness box and explain the artisan clause detail my credentials describe what my father had built and what Kevin had destroyed. Kevin sat at the defense table staring at me with pure hatred, and I stared back without flinching. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Embezzlement, fraud, forgery, theft. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in state prison with mandatory restitution. 8 years for trying to steal a man's life work. It didn't feel like enough, but it was what the law allowed. Kevin was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, still cursing me. You'll regret this. I'll get out. I'll burn that workshop to the ground. I'll make sure you lose everything. Officer Brennan, who'd escorted him out, came back and quietly suggested I get a restraining order for when he was eventually paroled. I'll be an old woman by then, I said. He laughed. These guys don't change. Better safe than sorry. 9 months after I came home, we held the grand opening of the Michael Morgan Institute for Traditional Craftsmanship. 200 people showed up. Former clients, craftspeople from across New England, reporters from Wooden Boat and Fine Woodworking magazines, representatives from preservation societies. The mayor came and gave a speech about the importance of preserving Maine's maritime heritage. The governor sent a letter of support. My mother cut the ribbon with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. Eric gave a demonstration on steam-bending wood, showing how a straight piece of white oak could be gradually curved into the shape of a boat rib. I gave a speech about why traditional skills mattered, about fighting for what you love about my father's vision, and how we were going to carry it forward. But the most important moment came later, after most people had left. A teenage girl, maybe 16, came up to me nervously. Her name was Maya, and she'd come with her grandfather, a lobsterman who'd bought his first boat from my father 30 years ago. She wanted to know if the apprenticeship program was real, if someone her age could really learn boat building. I took her into the workshop and showed her around, pointed out the lathe and explained its history, showed her the hand tools and let her feel the weight of them, pulled out plans for a Whitehall pulling boat we were starting next month, and explained how each piece would be shaped and fitted. And I watched her face light up with the same wonder I'd felt at 7 years old seeing my father work. You can start whenever you want, I told her. Weekends, summers, whenever your schedule allows. We'll teach you everything. But it's hard work and it takes time, and you have to promise to maintain the standards. To care about the difference between good enough and right. She promised. And 2 weeks later, she showed up on a Saturday morning ready to learn. Watching her take her first lesson from Eric learning to sharpen a chisel properly, I felt my father's presence in that workshop stronger than any time since he'd died. This was what he'd wanted. Not just boats, but the knowledge being passed on. The tradition continuing. That night, I went to the rocky point behind the workshop where my father used to think. The Atlantic was doing its eternal work waves, wearing away at rock patient and persistent. I thought about everything that had happened. The 3 years of preparation. The fight to reclaim what was mine. The slow rebuilding of trust with my mother. The satisfaction of seeing Kevin in handcuffs. The joy of watching a new generation discover these skills. My phone buzzed. A message from my firm in Chicago. They'd been patient about my leave of absence, but they needed to know my plans. Was I coming back? Or was I staying in Maine? I looked back at the workshop lights glowing warm in the gathering darkness. I thought about my apartment in Chicago, the career I'd built, the life I'd constructed there. And I thought about my father's workshop, about Maya, learning to sharpen chisels, about Eric, training new apprentices, about the waiting list of clients who wanted real Morgan boats again. The choice wasn't hard. Chicago was a career. This was a calling. I typed out my resignation, thanked them for the opportunity, and hit send before I could second-guess myself. I was staying. This was where I belonged. I went back inside and found my way to the office in the corner, the space my father had used for drawing up plans and meeting with clients. I'd left it mostly untouched, his drafting table still there, his reference books still on the shelves. I pulled out a fresh sheet of drafting paper and started sketching. Not a boat this time. The workshop expansion. A dedicated classroom space. A large lumber storage shed. Living quarters upstairs for apprentices who came from far away. A small museum area to display my father's work and the history of the craft. I drew for hours, losing myself in the details and the possibilities. When I finally looked up, it was past midnight. The workshop was quiet, except for the sound of wind outside and the old building settling. I stood and stretched, rolled up my plans, and turned off the lights. As I locked up, I looked around one more time. This place had been my father's dream. Then it had become my inheritance. Then my battlefield. And now it was becoming my legacy. I thought about Kevin sitting in a cell somewhere, bitter and angry. I thought about how he'd seen an opportunity to exploit a widow and steal a business. How he'd counted on me being too young, too far away, too weak to matter. How he'd systematically stripped away everything of value, thinking he was so clever. What he'd never understood was that the real value wasn't in the equipment or the property or even the client list. It was in the knowledge. In the skills passed from generation to generation. In the commitment to quality over profit. In the belief that some things matter more than money. You can't steal that. You can't sell it. You can only kill it by letting it die. And I'd made sure it didn't die. I'd played the long game my father taught me. I'd been patient when every instinct screamed to act. I'd gotten strong when strength was needed. And I'd come back and fought when the time was right. Not with violence or vengeance, though there'd been some of that. But with credentials and documentation and the law itself. The best revenge isn't destroying your enemy. It's rebuilding what they tried to destroy and making it greater than before. It's taking the weapons they used against you and turning those weapons back on them with such precision they can't even complain about fairness. It's winning so completely that they spend years behind bars with nothing to do but contemplate their mistake. Kevin had thought my father's workshop was an outdated relic, a dying business he could loot for quick profit. He was wrong. It was a seed carefully planted, protected with legal thorns, waiting for the right conditions to grow again. And I was the gardener who'd come home to tend it. As I drove back to my motel that night, past the dark shapes of boats and yards and the distant gleam of the ocean, I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. Peace. Not happiness exactly, because there was still too much work to do, too many relationships to heal, too many skills to teach. But peace. The kind that comes from knowing you did the right thing even when it was hard. The kind that comes from keeping a promise to someone you loved. My father had trusted me to protect his legacy. And I had. Not perfectly, not without cost, but successfully. The workshop was safe. The knowledge would continue. The next generation was learning. And somewhere I like to think my father was watching and nodding in approval. That's my girl. Here's what I want you to take away from my story. When someone tries to destroy something precious that was entrusted to you, whether it's a family business, a relationship, a home, or a dream, you have choices. You can fight immediately and probably lose because you're not ready. You can give up and let them win. Or you can do what I did, step back, get stronger, learn what you need to learn, and come back when you're ready to win decisively. Sometimes patience isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the most powerful weapon you have. If someone you love has ever had their life's work stolen or destroyed, if you've ever watched a predator circle someone vulnerable, if you've ever had to choose between fighting now and fighting later when you're stronger, I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, if it gave you hope or inspiration or just satisfaction seeing Kevin get what he deserved, smash that like button and subscribe, because I'm going to keep sharing these stories about people who refuse to let their legacies die. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have fought immediately or played the long game like I did? Let me know below.